Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on yet another episode. Today, we're going to talk about software testing, quality assurance, and how all of that stuff falls within the software development lifecycle. I have a very special guest today with me, Maaret Pyhäjärvi. She is a principal test engineer at Vaisala. She has been in the industry for 25 years. That's like a couple of decades and a little bit more than that. She had a wonderful career. She is a public speaker. A fun fact about her public speaking is that she's spoken about 28 different countries. That's an achievement all by itself. And we're going to discuss the relevance of testing engineers in the modern software development lifecycle. This is something I'm personally quite curious about. I've seen both ends. I've seen how quality assurance engineers can add tremendous value to the software practice, and I've seen how they can also become bottleneck. And today we're going to explore all of this with my guest. Maaret, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's great being here.
Of course. Can you tell me a little bit more about how did you begin your career in tech?
25 years ago, I had just gotten out of high school, and I had just started my studies in Helsinki University of Technology. And while I was in high school, I had studied the Greek language. And someone decided that because I had studied Greek language and because I had somehow managed to get into a university of technical nature, I could probably operate a computer. That was kind of the idea of how much you needed to know about testing when you got started in testing. You can operate a computer, you can read, well, I could read the Greek alphabet, and they had me test as my first project ever. They had me test the Greek office. So localized software, that type of testing was where I started off. And then I kind of, at some point, I decided no one likes testers and no one appreciates testers. And I became a developer for a while. Then I realized that no one actually appreciates developers any more than they appreciate testers. We always seem to kind of like think that, it's easier somehow for the other roles, and it is never. And I decided that instead of, being a tester or just a tester, I'm going to be one of the best testers they can be. And I'm still on that journey. So that's my story.
That's amazing. I love that. And I also relate to the idea of thinking that things are greener on the other side. I recently did the switch from consulting back to software engineering, thinking that things are going to be a little bit smoother. Turns out, no, it's just a different set of challenges. And that's it's always fun to see. All right, Maaret, over the past 25 years, how did software testing evolve?
I'm sometimes wondering if it was evolving because of the 25 years and kind of like the life changing and the world changing, or if it just evolved because I ended up meeting new people and it was always kind of like everything was always around. Like one of my favorite quotes in the whole world kind of is this idea that the future is already here. It's just not equally divided. So maybe it was already there and I just didn't pay attention to it back then. But what has definitely changed are things like continuous integration and continuous deployment. Like we actually fought those very hard against those back in the days. Kind of like, when you carefully select your changes, then you can carefully test each and every one of them. And now we know that rather than creating those bottlenecks or creating those kind of like gates that you have that may basically prevent you from doing the best possible work for your customers, you want to actually think the other way around. So we've definitely learned this one. But I also think that some of the technologies that we have made it a little easier nowadays, open source in particular.
How? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that last point?
Especially on the testing field, we have so many nice tools nowadays available. It used to be that we had these proprietary tools where you had like a limited 30-day trial and you never had time at the trial time. You always learned about the tool kind of later on. You had to already make the choices of what tool you would use and whether you would pay for the 1-year license minimum for your organization quite early on into the evaluation of a tool. So we didn't have this possibility of kind of like, taking Lego bricks. Right now I live in this kind of Python ecosystem where there's, PyTest, and you can take a plugin here, and you have the IDE, and you can take a plugin on that one, and just build and build and build whatever you're ready for on that day. So you can get started on kind of quite easy, but you can build basically indefinitely. And back in the days, it felt like, the box was much more rigid.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I can relate to all of that. We have fancy toolboxes now made bigger and bigger by the contributions of a lot of amazing people in the industry, for sure. So if we look back at software engineering or software development as a practice, right? Like we have people who imagine, think, design, and then they write the implementation of something they have imagined, right? We write code. How did you end up in a situation where we needed the intervention of people who are purely focused on testing?
I think we got to this basically two different directions. One is that, when you have 25 years of experience, it's kind of easy to think in terms of having just, 1 year of this and another year of that and another year of that. So when you're getting started, you need to start somewhere. And typically when we start, we just end up with some component, end up with some kind of task, end up with some kind of responsibility. And it made sense for many people that they would start from the angle of testing. That's one way that we ended up with this. Some people grow from testing to development. Some people grow from development to testing. Like, these are not rigid boxes, just like the components that we use, they're not rigid. But the other way I think we ended up with this one is that we've started to appreciate that even after 25 years, we may have a limited bandwidth, limited scope of things. And like you said, like you talked about this, like creativity and design and all of that. Like for me as a tester, when I look at an application, it's kind of like my external imagination, and it speaks to me. It gives me hints on what to do and what kind of things to look at. And it's the same creativity, just kind of targeted a little bit differently. When we have collaboration, that's definitely helpful as well.
Walk me through that a little bit. Like, so for example, both you and I were collaborating on a project, right? Let's say I worked on the design aspect. Do you get involved in the design phase as a testing engineer?
Yeah, typically I do. Like, for example, maybe some examples from the last couple of weeks at work. At the design stage of a REST API, we are talking about kind of like, what is the API called? Like, what's the endpoint name? And in this particular case, there was this idea that we would use verbs as those names. And I come to that conversation with like, hey, have you noticed that these are always nouns and the verbs are always fixed, and that there's this whole model of how it makes sense to people and how they think around these. And this is how, like people who don't really understand what it is, how they integrate. So I do participate in kind of like those insights into that question. And again, anyone could say those, but it's a lot of times I just happen to be more focused on that kind of consistency and ease and experience type of aspect, and bring it to those conversations. And another one is very typically things like the continuous integration pipeline. It's kind of pushing stuff through continuously, like it's really continuous, which means that our Dockerized environment is continuously restarting, which is not a problem. You can use it, nice handoffs, very fluent in that sense. But we also have certain components that are restarting that wouldn't be restarting in the same way in production environment, because we wouldn't be necessarily pushing as frequent changes there. So we have no knowledge of long-term perspective of testing. So kind of like, just suggesting that we would have another environment where we don't do continuous changes, so that we have those aspects of production. Just reminding people of all the kinds of things that we need to fast forward to have a representative, users and stakeholders, different kind of stakeholders perspectives.
Let's say things evolve a little bit. We start the development process. We have some deliverables that are already maybe ready to ship. Where do you get involved? Do you get involved then again? And what form does it take?
I usually get involved before the business decides what we're going to implement next year. So I get involved actually earlier than the developers. I'm usually helping make sure that the estimates that no one wants to make are safe enough so that we can all be successful in it together, and that quality can be included. So again, kind of looking at things from the point of view of the end game, I usually bring that perspective already very early on. So if there were contracts, I'm usually in the contracts. Now it's the business process, kind of like the next year's planning. I'm involved in that, whereas not all of the developers are. When we have a new feature, kind of like we're adding new capabilities, I'm usually part of that conversation. But sometimes I don't need to be part of that conversation. The developers can take care of it by themselves. And I just might kind of like, come into the end and help them kind of just, make sure that if there is still perspectives, I can add that we could add there. So I prefer if I'm kind of all the way through there. And a typical release, we just made a release this week. I have some nice numbers that I've been bragging about all week. We had 100 pull requests that we merged into that particular release. It was fairly small time frame of a release. We've been working on getting it shorter. And the release time frame, it was now 2 days. It has been 27 days the last time we ran through that process. So kind of like this, improvements also on efficiency and knowing that what we're promising.
Of course, I love that, because there's also like a wide misrepresentation of the industry as a whole. Not everyone is doing continuous integration. More importantly, continuous deployment and delivery. There are a lot of companies that pretty much cannot do that. There are companies that are highly governed, they are regulated, where you cannot really ship just whatever the developers are ready to ship, and there has to have to be specific release schedules and things like that. And this is where the game of trying to optimize and have more frequent releases come into play. I'm not sure what industry you are in. Does that represent
aviation right now?
Oh yeah, that makes sense. And obviously this is one of these industries where things cannot go as super fast as SaaS companies, for example.
But I would also think that to some extent that's something that we have created as an industry, and it is something that we can try changing as an industry. So to some extent, for example, with security related information that keeps coming up all the time, those industries in particular shouldn't be blocking the continuous change. But on the other hand, us in teams building that software, we need to be doing a lot better in being trustworthy towards those industries so that it can ever change. So I think that's a particularly good example where you can do faster release cycles, but you need to first build the trust, because it's actually the trust that is missing rather than the regulation driving it.
Interesting. I love this perspective, because I always felt that this is actually the case. It's a matter of different departments not trusting each other, and maybe stakeholders not trusting their own teams to deliver quality software. And then whenever something bad happens, which is inevitable in software, pointing fingers immediately starts to kick in, and people just become a little bit more risk averse, and then they start implementing all of these processes in the hopes that they would prevent these future problems from happening, but it never really works that way. Can you tell me more about that? How do you think we can establish more trust in between teams? How can we build it, and how can it become more efficient?
I believe it comes through practice. Like when you have to go through multiple releases and you get to work with the same people or the same organization, and there's a track record of doing a good job, caring for both sides, understanding the quality that the customer is expecting and needing, and understanding what kind of things cause trouble and what are easy and easy to fix. I think that's kind of how you build it. Like, so I've been thinking about a lot about this kind of like, I think in terms of results gap, that there's this kind of invisible area where everything surprises many teams, developers in particular, and then testers are very often working with that results gap in trying to kind of make it visible. And I think the same results gap is making the customers test organizations, acceptance test organizations in particular, not trust whatever we are delivering to them, because they have a different life experience, different perspective, and they're worried that we might not know what they actually need and mean. And we keep thinking that by controlling that change, we could somehow make it better. Like, well, those customer organizations keep thinking that way. But actually, when they get smaller changes, they can control that rate of change actually a lot better. So more frequent is safer rather than the other way around, but it takes time to get this message across.
Awesome. I have a challenging question here because I think we end up sort of in a chicken and egg type of situation where the existence of a quality assurance team creates sort of this behavior for software engineers where they can say, yeah, there's a team that can take care of testing, so why should I bother with testing myself? They will take care of it, right? And the lack of a team like that might force maybe developers to actually engage in deeper, heavier, more, in testing efforts, let's say. What's your perspective on this?
I've seen that so many times. It's one of the forces that I need to work with continuously. The first thing that I do usually is that I don't have a quality assurance team. I have someone who knows a little bit more amongst the developers, who does work in the quality assurance space, and hopefully is also someone who wants to kind of a little bit break those barriers of, my work, your work. But if something needs to be kind of centered in that person's life and work, and you get to do those prioritization choices, I'd like that person to be someone who centers testing and quality instead of, whatever the other ones in that moment tend to center. I've been in teams where it feels like, I feel like sometimes that I'm the mother who is attending to the children who drop the pizza boxes in the middle of the living room floor, and that those children think that my role as a mother is to kind of point at the pizza box and say, no salami pizza boxes in here, no that kind. And again, like, a week later, it's again salami pizza box. And that's definitely not the work that I would like to see people who specialize in testing doing. But sometimes it really takes these challenges. I remember this one lovely colleague that I had in an earlier company, and he said that, he likes me. He likes me a lot. Like he thinks I'm a great person, and he doesn't want to make me unemployed. So that's why he can't test. And I said, like, a challenge accepted. If you can make me unemployed, I'm happy to find a new job. But I'm pretty sure, and well, turns out so far I've been at least, right about this. I'm pretty sure that we're going to have bigger systems and bigger challenges that we need to deal with. So whatever work he does in this space, it's not away from me. It's actually for all of us. But these are common conversations that we need to have.
So I see a lot of engineers who only do quality assurance type of work. They've been pivoting towards more testing automation. Irrespective of our ideal model, this type of profile exists. Do you feel like a testing engineer can be effective if they are not very much involved in the code base, or do you think the fact that they're not involved in the code base gives them a nice, fresher perspective where they can explore the software in a better way that allows them to identify problems?
So it really depends on the rest of the team and what the rest of the team is and needs, like what kind of gaps we have. So a lot of the teams that I work with, they benefit from having a product owner as well, someone who talks to the customer and really understands what the customer is saying and what the customer cares for, and somehow kind of like, brings home the important information that the customer organizations, again, we might have millions of customers, so there's a lot of analysis work in that space. That's valuable work as well. So I believe that we can, and in many organizations we do have testers who actually spend more of their time in that space, kind of like as a second and a pair of the product owner rather than the developer's pair. So there's many kinds of testers, but in guessing what might go wrong, if you don't know about architectures, if you don't know about technologies, and if you at least can't work closely with people who spend most of their time in that area, I think you're gonna have trouble eventually.
So we touched upon, continuous integration, continuous deployment. How can we really achieve that if we have testing engineers involved? And I think you already brushed on how you not really don't want to become a bottleneck in this entire process. Can you guide me more towards like, how is it done in the modern world?
You can put things, well, first of all, you can put things in production without them going through the test engineer. The test engineer can work with the version in production to make the next version in production better. That's always a possibility. Also, you can kind of like pair up with people. Well, pair up the people so that they work together on the change, so that you would have those things that you are concerned about quality-wise in that moment. Like, for example, when I've been doing ensemble programming, I've really enjoyed the fact I'm kind of like, I get bored very easily looking at code with the developers. So I've been sometimes saying kind of like, we did this there was like a user interface related change that I'm thinking of right now. And they would always kind of open the Chrome browser because, routine, Chrome browser open, and then you check whatever you had there and you see if your elements are in the place where you wanted them. And I was like, can you just open it in another browser for a change? Like, I'm so tired of this Chrome. And we found some bugs in IE, which I made them use for the next 15 minutes. That was the maximum they would have used IE in that moment. But it was just the right moment for them to kind of fix the IE problem and then go back to Chrome and not have the IE problem. So kind of like, when you have these hunches, like if you're really good at going close and working on those continuous changes and the risks that come out of those, that's where you can do it. But also, it's never too late. Like, you can and you should still improve the software that is in production. And it's kind of like a quest of time on, are your customers telling you about the problems? Are your own people telling you about the problems? Maybe it's, doing analytics from the production. It's equally stuff around figuring out what might be wrong right now. So sharing all of that work, you can do that in many ways.
From your description, it feels to me like it's more of a mindset than it is really a set of skills that people can actually adopt. Do you agree with this perspective?
I do agree with that. It's much more of a mindset and kind of like just holding space for quality. And in my current team right now, we just decided not to hire a tester. There was a position for tester open. We hire yet another software developer, and I'm very much for this. They're kind of throwing this challenge to me, saying that you make us the best testers ever, and each of them takes 2 months at a time, so they get now focused time on where they don't have to kind of like make big promises on the features, but they can actually work on kind of improving the system and collaborating more with the types of things that I would normally be doing. So I would love for teams to do more of that kind of work. But sometimes the systems are so big that we want to draw the barriers of, this is my interests, and we need other people who are kind of more focused on the fuzzy gray areas, like the dependencies that we didn't create, that we can't fix anyway, but they need to be tested as part of our system anyway.
You know what I find a bit fascinating is that a lot of the testing efforts previously and quality, what we claim to be quality, focuses a lot on the end product outcome, or what is visible to end users and customers. I have rarely seen people involved in guaranteeing quality of the code base, for example, taking care of technical debt, reminding people that we actually have to pay off technical debt and whatnot. What's your perspective on this? Is this something you and your team are involved with as well?
Yeah, I do a lot of that. There's always these choices of like, I've been asked to do, like, so many managers ask me to do kind of like test cases or test automation on top of something where there's a lot of technical debt. And then I work out a way of communicating with the team that instead of adding single tests, any tests at all, we should be actually fixing some of the things that are causing the reason of us needing those tests. And it's a continuous effort that I think, well, if you can see the bigger picture, kind of like the balances of, you can fix this or this and you will have the same impact. If those are the conversations that your team is capable of having, you're likely to do better. But a lot of organizations, I find, put their testers in particular in a position where they just tell them that you need to now automate the test cases. This is your job. And while I can say no after 25 years, I could already say no after 15 years. I also remember the old self that I had, me, younger me. It was much harder to say no. And again, when you're hired to do a job, saying no to the job you're hired, it's not the easiest thing to do.
100%. It's funny because when companies hire, they are hiring you because you should be the expert in a certain area, and then they bring you in and they tell you exactly what to do, which kind of defeats the purpose of hiring you as the expert. Well, they should be listening and implementing what you have to say. They think they know better. Anyway, I totally relate to whatever you're saying. So stakeholders and maybe CTOs or higher level executives, they want to have some insight over what's happening in their organization. Are there ways to measure the quality of software, for example? Is this something you think is feasible? If yes, do you have any metrics? If not, why not?
I'm asked of this a lot, that I can say. It's kind of hard to measure absence of something. Like if you try to measure number of bugs that you're addressing, it's not really telling you much about the future of the things you might have been missing. So I've been usually trying to solve this. Well, I needed to solve it in my previous product here in Vaisala. And I've been solving it by having 3 months and 6 months kind of like tails after putting something in production on tracking what the customer feedback is and whether I can link it back to any of the changes, kind of like doing a lot of the measurement work afterwards. That's not what they really want. They want something that could give them, like a blinking light saying, now there's a danger, I can do something already right now. But at least it helps in understanding whether you are doing a good job or not when you're following that. And it usually means that for example, I needed to ask for accesses to systems that I normally don't have access to. The support systems are usually separate. I needed to take time from my day-to-day stuff on current features to look at something everyone else has completed 6 months ago. It's not an easy thing to do. But generally, my idea with metrics is that I'd like to focus on change. So without change, change can make things worse, of course, but without change, we can't get better. We can't have more, we can't have better. So I usually have my metrics that I provide the managers around change, a number of merged pull requests, time that pull requests are waiting. If we are reviewing and actively working on them, that's a whole different thing. But generally, if we have smaller changes going through, we are doing a better job at looking at what the change is and avoiding breaking anything particularly surprising. So I look at those kind of things. And it also gives me an idea of productivity and kind of like the flow through whatever software development system we have ongoing right now. I don't want to report bugs. I have actually put a lot of effort into not even writing bug reports if I can avoid it, like getting a developer and pairing with them on fixing something so that it can just vanish. It shows up in a pull request, but nowhere else. And I find that all the test case metrics, absolutely you should not. The only reason to count numbers of test cases is to show that you're not losing any of them when you're going forward. But that you're kind of keeping whatever you had and growing from that rather than taking them away.
Have these metrics that you just listed, do you feel they are effective, or are they just calming to managers without necessarily being too
They are
valuable?
calming.
Yeah.
More calming.
They're not signal per se.
Yeah.
Interesting. Because intuitively, you would assume that the number of pull requests merged could be an indication of the team performance. But the problem with that is that there are so many variables that can affect this. Maybe the changes are too big. Maybe, I don't know, the requirements were not clear when we were trying to build this, and that affected how long we wanted to deliver.
Yeah, for us at least, the way that we like to think around the software development team is also that we want to discover some of the requirements. We don't want to get them kind of readily chewed from someone. We want to actually be there to figure them out. So we always take some time on what we call discovery work. We try to not have too many items of discovery work ongoing at the same time. And we have conversations around the pull request numbers on kind of we were, this week's, we were really focused on discovery of these new features. and kind of like just then balancing on is this the right balance between discovery and delivery work. And sometimes, particularly in this organization, we have a request to overanalyze early on, and this whole conversation of balance is the best thing that those metrics can give us, so that we can steer.
So a lot of organizations have adopted I don't know how to call it, but it's like a weird version of agile, right? A lot of organizations even misuse the term agile. They think that by just implementing a waterfall version of Scrum, they are doing agile. What's your perspective, first of all, on the agile methodology? And the second is, what is your perspective on how it's being implemented in some of these organizations?
I started working with the so-called lightweight or agile methods in 1997. I was a very, very early adopter. I was a researcher back then, and we were researching small companies and their software processes. And agile, the emerging agile back then, seemed like the only rational thing to look at. I went through multiple companies, big agile transformations. I decided to change my mind about never wanting children because agile was so bad at early stages of it. And nowadays, my take is more on the side of, if I can avoid talking about agile and just talk about smart ways of working, I would prefer doing that. It has really become this kind of like we think we mean the same thing, but we don't even know what we're talking about anymore. And that happens when you have 20 years of global conversations on a thing that was never anything other than a fuzzy idea in the first place.
Interesting that you say that, because it feels like now, with the amount of coaches, companies offering agile training and the SAFe methodology and all of that fun stuff and the tooling that exists around this, that this is more of a concrete, battle-tested type of approach to work. But unfortunately, it's not. And it's sad to hear everybody complain that this doesn't really add any much value to their way of working.
I joined this team of mine that I'm working with mostly right now. I joined earlier this year, well, start of this year actually. And I joined because they had some trouble implementing their agile, and testing and all of that stuff was kind of fuzzy. Being able to deliver was kind of fuzzy. And I remember that one of the first fights that I needed to really go through with some of the people in the management is Scrum versus Kanban. Like, do we have to be able to promise things for the next 2 weeks? And I got, with my status and my prestige, I got through this humorous for a few months. Let me show you how Kanban works. So we got to this kind of continuous flow and a lot more freedom in, well, we don't do estimates, for example. It was really difficult to get rid of that. And now in the last 4 weeks, we've been doing no Jira. So we have our product owner creates a couple of Jira tasks on Epic level for himself so that he can report on us externally with those. But the team itself doesn't touch Jira anymore. We come to daily meetings with a lot of energy and figure out what's the smartest thing to do next. And when we get something done or we get stuck, we talk to each other, and we don't write Jira tickets, and they're not in the wrong state, and we don't have to have all those conversations about them being in the wrong state. And again, this was something where it was supposed to be catastrophic, according to some people, and it turned out to be a major improvement. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that it's great that, I can show up and say, we're going to try something different. And I can kind of get that through to some of the people who decide. But it's so sad that that's not always heard from everyone else. Because I think we have good ideas, and when we get to implement those good ideas that we have, we tend to feel more responsible for the results, and the results is what matters in the end.
100%. I love hearing this, because also, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, it all boils down to trust, right? Like, if you trust the people who are working, you're not going to have issues thinking that, oh, they're wasting their time with this, they're wasting their time with that. I need to micromanage every single moment. And I need to make sure that they're working the 8-9 hours a day because I'm running a mining operation and everybody needs to, sort of deliver on every single minute of their waking hour. While effectively, if you let teams be a little bit more loose and you hire the proper people, right, in the first place, then they will be much more effective than when you treat them as if they are just a cog in a big machine and they need to deliver very small, specific chunks of work at specific periods of time. I'm gonna challenge this a little bit and play the devil's advocate. So let's say you are a CTO in a company, you have your board asking you for timeframes of deliverables of certain features, for example, or maybe even big projects or changes. How do you communicate this to your board if your teams don't report back or report upwards estimates and timeframes? How could you reconcile this?
They can still report what comes out of the pipeline, even if they don't report what they thought they can put into the pipeline. So again, continuously delivering in small chunks, looking at what's the value that we have there, seeing whether we are finding more work, if we can kind of improve on the understanding and doing just the right things, doing the smaller thing that would actually serve the business already. I think we already have those things there. So in some organizations, I've kind of like created lists of let's go back the whole year and let's list all the features that we have as organization delivered in the last year. Then we do after the fact estimation. So do you remember when we did this feature? How big was it? That's when you know the most about the feature because you've already built it. So you can give an estimate on how big it was. It's no longer guesswork. It's now remembering work. And you don't have to pay a lot of money, as in time, in creating those numbers because basically you just ask people, and if it's not so accurate, it's not super accurate, that doesn't really matter. So instead of kind of continuously trying to measure it, you can do a cadence after the fact where you can have some kind of numbers. And you can have the same thing on business. Like one of those experiments that I did in my previous organization, I listed all those features and I gave it to a business and said, how valuable were these features that you asked us to deliver? And it was surprising how the smallest things that they actually even didn't want in the first place turned out to be the more valuable ones. And the ones that they kind of, insisted and prioritized and put on the roadmaps hadn't yet even started paying back. So we had really good conversations on this kind of like after the fact estimation. I think there's plenty of ways that we can figure out how we can have those conversations that don't rely on making us do guesswork on scale.
100%. And it is guesswork. I see a lot of conversations about number of story points, and I think these are just ridiculous. Like if they happen in a team, someone says 3 story points, someone says 5, and if you ask every person, what does it mean 3 story points effectively, right? Everybody will have a different answer from the other person. And it's just funny to see these things in play. I know a lot of people hearing this will be offended. I'm sorry, but it's a good reminder to revisit your practices and look at how you are actually doing things. Perfect. Maaret, I want to look a little bit forward into the future. But before we do that, can you tell me a little bit more about what exploratory testing is?
Exploratory testing is this idea that you don't separate things that belong together so that you can have agency. And when you can have agency, meaning people can make their choices, they can actively learn. So your previous test can have an impact on the next test you do. And instead of kind of following a plan that you did when you knew the least, you are continuously improving and creating that plan and taking in whatever you're learning. So some people say it's kind of like you do multiple things simultaneously, but it's not really simultaneous. It's kind of like a processor. It's not like single thread processors do things simultaneously. They just move between the threads quite fast so that everyone gets a little bit of execution time. And usually as you become more senior, your processor of, doing something in the background and doing something in the foreground it evolves because you're learning. And that's kind of what exploratory testing also is about, that you are fine-tuning that processor of yours continuously.
Interesting. And how do you feel, or what's next actually for software testing and software in general? We are seeing certain trends like machine learning creeping into our day-to-day, AI software writing pieces of code. I work at GitHub. We have released Copilot recently. I was a bit skeptical about it at first, and then I started using it, and I'm like, interesting paradigm shift. So what's your perspective on all of this?
I think all of this is related to the fact that systems are getting bigger and more complicated, and we need some kind of productivity tools. So they probably will shift a little bit, kind of the type of problems we will have. I also have enjoyed Copilot a lot. I've been playing with it, and I've been doing some training sessions where we use Copilot as the programmer, and all of the developers in the group are being the testers, because now it's not giving you the tests, it's only giving you the created code, and you are now the tester who is responsible for someone else's code. So it does that really nice kind of like, twist of a mind.
I will tell the team about this. That's a very interesting use case. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fun thing to do. But I don't think I'm expecting kind of anything big. I'm just expecting that, the future is already here. It's not equally divided. I would hope it gets more equally divided. I would hope that some of the things that, small groups have good experiences on would get to the majority, the laggards, the masses as well. And that everyone gets to enjoy software development a lot more. Because I also think that one big challenge of the future is that we will still have work to do for people. And software will need new people continuously. We need to have those newbies who don't yet know much, but will know a lot by the end of their career. We need to have them started. We need to help them grow. So I'm sure there will be a mix of different technologies that we're looking at in different places, but there's not like a massive one technology that I would be expecting. I'm hoping people learn to be nice to each other and collaborate more. Maybe that's my hope for the future.
I hope so too. The last question I have for you, Maaret, is what is your advice for engineers who are still doing traditional quality assurance testing type of work? How do you think they should evolve their careers?
Usually the people who do this traditional work, they expect someone else to give them requirements, and then they're behaving like secretaries to the person who gave the requirements and checking those. Their customers know whether it works or not without reading those requirements. And they are not more stupid than their customers. They can and they should be taking more active role in providing that feedback. So no matter what they do, they should be taking new skills, and there's such a selection of new skills that you can continuously pick up on, that it doesn't have to be just automation or just particular type of automation. There's a variety of options.
Maaret, this is fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, your insights, your experience, and sharing all of your knowledge with us. I've really had a blast talking to you.
It's been great being here. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you next time.